Hello, friends, and welcome to the Learning Future podcast. I'm your host, Louka Parry, and today it's my absolute delight to be speaking with Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel. She focuses on equity, social justice, and the experiences of people who are often excluded from design education, research, and practice. She currently teaches at North Carolina State University and formerly was the Associate Director of Design Thinking for Social Impact at Tulane University, as well as a lecturer at Stanford and the University of the West Indies. I currently have in my hand the wonderful D.school guide that she has authored. It's entitled Design Social Change. Take action, work towards equity, and challenge the status quo. Lesley-Ann, it's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you, Louka. And I told you just a few minutes ago, my bio has to change again.
It's so good. We're going to do that.
I'm going to do that. I'll be moving to OCAD University in the fall. So that's Ontario College of Art and Design, where I'm excited to continue the work that they've been doing on decolonizing design and making change. And I think it aligns with my values and my work.
Oh, congratulations on that. I mean, there's so many wonderful, deep concepts here in kind of this book that you've put together, which clearly is a reflection of the work that you've done over many years. You know, this idea about like, how do we know ourselves really well? How do we use and deepen our emotional intelligence? How do we cultivate critical awareness? And then, of course, envisage the future that we want. You know, it really kind of got a lot in here. But my first question always to the wonderful guests is, what's something that you're learning at the moment? Like, what's in the forefront of your mind as you do this work towards liberation, abolition, a whole range of other design principles?
Well, when you ask me this, I think about two things. So the first thing that's really in the front of my mind is learning this new city that I'll be moving to, right, which is Toronto.
And the accent.
As they say.
Toronto.
The accent. Yes. But actually, for the last few years, I've been very interested in gardening, which people might think, okay, what does that have to do with design? But some years ago, a friend of mine who's a professor in South Africa, he said to me, hey, you with your pluriverse stuff, which is a philosophy that I talk about, right? He said, you cannot really be decolonizing design if you're not teaching about the land and about gardening and about growing your own food. And, you know, if we're not bringing it down to that level. And so I think for the last 3 years, I've really been interested in questions around food, where food comes from. Can we really make our own food? And then wider than that, because I had a lot of field experiments in planting food and some successful ones, but I've actually also moved on to food for others. So I have really maybe decolonized my backyard. So I have a very messy backyard with no lawn and lots and lots of native plants. And it is full of birds and animals and insects. And yes, that's what I'm into. Yeah.
I love it. And I mean, two things come to my mind. One, it now makes sense why this book, you know, says was almost a cookbook, you know, one you said in the intro. But the other piece, and I hadn't thought about it so much as decolonization, but it makes complete sense. I think of it as rewilding. But you kind of think about the way that we as human beings try to restrict and control the natural world so intensely and not really allow it to take its normal course. I mean, you think about the manicured lawns that you can't walk on, you know, this kind of stuff. Instead of like, what is the kind of the local flora of this place that's representative of this place? You know, and the kind of place making that can come from that. It's such a great reflection. Man, that's amazing. Well, you have to start the garden again, aren't you, Leslie?
That's driving me. I don't know. It's really killing me that, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to start over. But actually, that's also part of it, you know, letting things go, letting the next homeowner decide if they want to keep the wild garden or not, or, you know, so it's like the circle continues and I get to start again.
That's beautiful. Again, that's a very kind of life-centric way of thinking. So we talk a lot at the Learning Future around about regenerative education. You know, this idea of like regeneration, you know, there is this kind of maturity and then there's this natural destructive process. creative
Yeah.
destruction into, renewal, and then into birth and growth once more. And it's kind of, what might it look like if we thought of our organizations as living systems? This is a question that we pose often. And it's kind of the idea of bringing a lot like life back into a human system, but also into a local ecology.
Yes.
And I wonder about like the role of, because in this, I mean, design social change, everybody is a change maker, even if we don't realize it. We're kind of either reinforcing or breaking down particular levels of oppression, or our own biases. Take us into some of the big ideas in this work.
So I'm going to add to what you just said. You said everybody's a change maker. And I also like to emphasize everybody's a designer. And
Nice.
and I mean, the two roles are overlapping. And, so people who are like more formally trained in design sometimes ask me things like, you're going to let everybody in? Is everybody Yeah, it's not our little gated community that we're going to shut some people out, right? Everybody actually has these skills and abilities. And so the book is very inspired by the work of Paulo Freire in particular, but many other people who have read, like bell hooks. And I don't actually think I quote Toni Morrison, but sometimes I do. But it's very Freirean. And the book starts off asking people to look at themselves, right? And it's based actually on the PhD work that I did, where I worked with young children and asked them to critique the world around them and then take action through design. So, that's actually where it really, really, really started. About 6 years ago, I did this, maybe 7 years ago, I did this intervention during my PhD fieldwork with children. And since then, I've been kind of modifying the same method over and over and over, where I'm always asking people, start with yourself, think about who you are and the things that are important to you. And I've really asked people to think, where is the world not good enough? And then what is the change needed to fix that? Right. And so we start off then starting learning to see the world around us. And also understanding that world can be changed. And that's a very Freirean notion, the idea that the world doesn't just happen to you, you also happen to the world, right? So we have a lot of agency, right? So that first big idea, learning to see the world around us, learning to see ourselves, learning to see the world around us, learning to understand oppression, right? And then figuring out what we need to change. So that's like the first thing. The second big idea is about emotional intelligence, where I don't know about everybody's design education, but I know in my design education, we were often kind of encouraged to be a little bit neutral. We could have passion about some things, but when we think that we're doing research, we present things in a very neutral way.
Yeah, objective.
Right?
Yes.
Objective, and yes. And that's supposed to be good.
Yes.
And the emotions are bad. And actually, I'm asking people then to really build their emotional intelligence in the second part of the book. So learn to listen to anger, learn to listen to joy, anger in particular, because when people want something to change, they become angry. And then what happens? The world, the dominant group, or the group just below the dominant group, right? Like the middle classes, or, will be like, oh my God, those people got so angry. Let's stop what they're doing, right? And so we try to suppress people's emotion rather than trying to listen to it. And then the next section is about joy, where we're asking people, okay, I'm asking people to reflect on what are the things that make people happy? What are the things that make you happy? And can we bring that into the design processes and solutions that we create? And then there are a few other ideas there, but also there's this idea of community, because this modern world that we live in, very often is telling us to be very individualistic. You do this thing alone and you're successful alone and all that. But actually, as many of your educator colleagues would know, we need communities to thrive. right? So we have to build communities around the change that we want. So I'm interested in native plants. I have to find other native plant people and build a community around that so that I can actually survive some of the pushback and that I might get in the world, right? And then the next big idea is about dreaming and dreaming about the world that you want and actually taking action, right? And that's why then this is really a design book, because designers learn to take action, right?
Yeah.
Not every profession is active, but certainly creative people, designers, chefs, musicians, we take action, we do things. And so that's what I'm nudging people in the last section to do. Think about what is the action that you think is needed and do something about it to make the world better.
I love that it kind of starts. I mean, there's so many beautiful things there. I found the anger and joy parts of it really profound, because there is this idea that your knowledge should acquire knowledge in some way, sometimes a neutral kind of way as well, like within a school context or education context, instead of using the things that make us the most human, which of course is our emotional journey and our social connectedness. I was really, and I was, this idea that anger becomes internalized sadness is one that I think is so interesting. And this piece towards the future, like, how do we dream? Oh, there's a question you say, it's like, how do we learn to see? I just love that question because it's, such a piece of, if you can't notice, you're not able to design well, because we're always answering the right questions.
You're not paying attention. Yes.
And it's pretty hard to notice, I find, in the modern world, because everything's so fast and it's kind of bombarding a lot of our kind of cognitive load. I got a question for you, Lesley-Ann. And you started so beautifully in the book, and I feel like to be a designer and a change maker, there is this know yourself that begins, because none of us are neutral. None of us are kind of beige. It's like we've all got a position, and you talk about positionality, and so I'd love you to just tell us a bit more about who you are, because clearly your journey to this moment is why you do the work you do and how you've chosen to show up in the world. So give us a bit more of that journey.
My positionality, right. So there are many facets, like everybody else. I'm multifaceted, but I'll start off, your audience is listening. I'll start off with my accent, right? So I'm from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And I was born in the 1970s, like just at the time when there was a lot of like political action. So I think that I grew up in a home where people were asking questions, right? And when I talk with my parents, they're still asking questions. So I can definitely see how their positionality affected me. The time that they were born in, the moment, that they were like in their first generation of people in the Caribbean who went to university. So that kind of intellectual questioning and all that did affect me. And I grew up then with a certain amount of openness and freedom, and kind of knowing that this world was mine, in quotes, air quotes. But maybe that also is the post-independence kind of movement that I grew up in, because I was born 10 years after independence in Trinidad. And so that's a time as well when people are thinking, okay, we own this place, right? And that then gave me a certain amount of confidence to be able to move in the world, right? Yes. And so what else can I share? I moved to Brazil. Afterwards, I spent 6 years in Brazil.
Okay. Sorry, just internet just dropped for a sec. That's my side, I think. You keep going. So we got 6 years in Brazil.
Okay, good. All right. So I lived in Brazil for 6 years, where I studied industrial design. And I think my parents must have been out of their minds to say, okay, go off into this foreign country and we don't even speak the language and you're going to spend 6 years there.
Wow.
But then that also gave me a certain sense of power, and that awareness again that, okay, we can actually go through life and make mistakes. Because when I was choosing to go to Brazil, a friend of mine from the Brazilian embassy said to me, you know what, just go. And if you don't like it, you come back. And I thought, oh, wow, we can do that.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, you have agency the whole time. Oh, wow.
Yes, yes. So I guess my whole life has then been about this agency. And all of that, if we fast forward 30 years now to my PhD in North Carolina, I was interested in seeing how we could use design. I've been in design since middle school, and I was interested in seeing how can we use design to create a better sense of agency. And then how do we get people to use design to design systems, design the world around them? Because we're using the same abilities that we use when we design a poster or we design a chair. And maybe we could bring that into just designing these worlds around us. So that was like a really, really quick around the world, 50-something years. But yeah, and here we are, right?
Here we are.
Trying to get people to change the world through design.
It's interesting because I feel like your answers to that question and this idea of positionality, which might be a new word for some of our listeners, by the way, is, like what are the kind of multiple identities that we hold? It's like we are trying to change the world through design, but as we also have to change ourselves, and that this is, I think, the big interesting thing that you often place here is that everything kind of begins with your own, like, how do you learn to see another person more fully?
Yeah.
If and we're always just kind of seeing through our own lens. So the ability to take perspective, to step out of one's own thing. I'm not at all surprised you spent time in Brazil and, kind of traveled, and kind of live in the US, moving to Canada. All of that means that you have these multiple lenses, which I think is a gift that if we can give that to young people, then they can see possibility in different ways rather than being stuck in a worldview, which is kind of starts to calcify and solidify across the course of the lifespan. How do you cultivate open-mindedness, really, is kind of another question.
Yeah, so like even before we get there, the thing about the positionality bit, right, is I learned to write about my positionality while I was doing my PhD. And I'm very aware of my identities. I'm very aware of my Blackness, my Caribbeanness, my womanness, but what I really learned in that part of the doctoral program was really how to see that actually I'm always carrying my identities with me. And so I need to be very aware of them. And I had a little light bulb moment in that class where I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'm from the world of design and I've never really had to reflect on my identities as I design something. But design is so subjective that obviously I'm always carrying my identities with me. So there's a reason that I might make my water bottle blue or that I did, so every design that I make actually is impacted by my identities. And so what I've done in that section and then what I've done in the classes that I teach is really encourage people to see their identities so that they're aware of what agendas they might be carrying with them, right? And you don't have to be afraid of your agendas. Well, sometimes we have to, but it's that we have to see them, right? And we have to know that we're going in with a certain kind of agenda in the work that we're doing.
A question, Lesley-Ann, in all of your experience in working with design students in the higher education sector, our work really is at the K-12 space. And I'm really curious about even kind of the willingness to change and have those conversations. I mean, this year, for example, happens to be like they're calling I think a super political, whatever. There's some very, because there's more elections happening this year. 50% of the world's population goes to elections or something this year, all countries of the
Oh,
world.
wow.
It's just all aligned as it tends to
Yeah.
do every couple of decades. So there's a lot of kind of change in the air, if I can put it that way. Like, what is it
Yeah.
that you find are the ways to disarm some of the resistance we have to change? Because I feel like in all the work that we see in this moment of rapid transition, emerging technologies, etc., social community aspects, like, what is it like? How do you become a better designer, I guess, is another question for me. Because a good designer is someone that can hold multiplicity to kind of go down into some of the other work that you do.
So, you know, like when I ask people to change, sometimes they come back with the question of, or they come back with that kind of phrase, well, if it ain't broke, why are we trying to fix it, right? And
it's a favorite, that one. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, which is like, okay, everything is good enough as it is. Let's not do anything. And then I have to move into other conversations and say, well, actually, it might be good enough for X group of people.
Interesting.
But maybe it's not good enough for Y group of people. And we have to learn to be able to see that, right? And so sometimes when I start off with that conversation, it gets a little bit better. But sometimes it's still, you know, people are still kind of stuck in their mode. But, you know, when I start to also point out things like change that has happened over a certain lifespan, right? It depends on the audience that I'm speaking with. I might change the examples that I give. But I often like to think about my mother, who is 78, I believe.
Cool.
I can't remember. I'm supposed to know.
Roundabouts.
And my mother tells me that when she was born, she knew of people who had been born into slavery. And that's not then that long ago. So, you know, if we look at her lifespan and then maybe the lifespan of a few people older than her, they would have seen things like the end of slavery, voting rights, the civil rights movement, you know, and we started to think about all of the changes that happened throughout that lifespan. And a lot of those things that changed, somebody at some point would have said, you know what, actually it's good enough and we don't need to change things, right? But then eventually the way that the society changed, things changed, and that caused another change to happen, right? And so that's another thing that I talk about. And very often I break it down to people and they ask, well, what is social change? And I'll say, well, social change is when an entire society changes the way that they think about an issue. And as a result of that, we change laws and structures and all of these other things have to change because we've changed the way that we think about the issue. And that's what we're trying to get to. And if they still don't respond to that, actually, here's the really simple example I give.
Sure.
That sometimes gets to people. I ask if they have any people in their life who are left-handed. Obviously, are you left-handed?
No.
Okay. Because I said this the other day to somebody who was left-handed, and they said, "Oh my God, I feel so triggered." Right? But you know, I open with that and say, "Do you know anybody who is left-handed?"
Yeah.
And they'll say, "Yeah." And say, "Well, do you know that?" I mean, I've created a term. Well, I don't know if I've created it, but you know, I talk about left-handed oppression, right? And the health outcomes for left-handed people are lower. The life expectancy is lower. You know, we could kind of go through life kind of saying, well, that's just a coincidence and we're not going to do anything about it. But when you start to see ordinary people in your life being affected by things like that, then maybe you start to ask, okay, we could do something about this. Maybe we could just make sure there's one left-handed scissors in the room, right? Or, you know, and that's when it's kind of simple like that, because people are afraid to talk about race. They might be afraid to talk about gender. They might be afraid to talk about pronouns. They might be, but I can talk about left-handedness without offending people normally. And then that's when it kind of starts to make some sense.
It's such a great example. It's such a simple one, but it's the left-handed scissors. I've seen a video of someone being gifted left-handed scissors and they use them for the first time and they just start crying because there's something so profound about being designed for or something,
Yeah.
you know, actually, and going like, oh, I feel so seen and valued.
Yeah.
And I guess
Yes.
that's the issue, I think, with the kind of the efficiency paradigm of the world, but certainly of education, is that it kind of designs for nobody, actually.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of the mass educational model kind of designs for this archetype of a compliant academic, you know,
Brilliant.
brilliant, but single
Yeah.
person. Instead of, you know,
Yeah.
and this is what Todd Rose calls the myth of average, you know, which is great. The
Mm-hmm.
average actually represents nobody because
Yes.
what is actually completely that person. So it's this really interesting idea of thinking about the beautiful diversity of the human expression, just
Mm-hmm.
as you would see in the garden, you know, not just metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
but literally that you're cultivating. That, and then how do you think about designing for the extremes, designing for all? And
Yeah.
equity is such a massive theme in all education systems. In every single school, we always talk about equity, Lesley-Ann, and but you look at the data and you just see like glacial change, you know, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just and it's I'm just curious about some of the ways you would reflect on what might be needed when you think about transformation in education. And
Mm-hmm.
I point to things like what should we abolish, like your abolitionist mindset thing. I think is really,
Yeah.
how do you shift power? How do you repurpose? How do you move to co-design, doing things with people rather than
Yeah.
to them? I mean,
Yes. Yes.
yeah, what are some of your
Yeah.
reflections on this moment? Because clearly we're all in this state of
Ye-
disruption and flux.
I have so many things to say and so many
Great.
reflections. I'm going to go back to the positionality bit just for a little while
Sure.
and say part of why I emphasize that positionality bit is because I don't want people to try to be average, to try to fit in, and to, and I'm asking people to kind of come as they are with the issues that they think that are important, bring them to the table so that other people can understand them, right? Because when you just talked about that myth of average, that's really actually part of the crisis maybe that we're in, right? That we're trying to just design this world for this imaginary group of people. But if we are designing the world for real people with real issues and real problems, and people who really need left-handed can openers, and then we'll get to things that that make a lot of sense, right? So that is one of the questions that I'm interested in changing in education, where we can see more clearly what are the issues that are important to people and ordinary people at all levels. So we're not just trying to have people hide their economic challenges or their whatever challenges they might have. Bring them so that we understand them and then we can design around them. The other theme that I'm very interested in is agency.
Yes.
So that people know that they have the power to influence the world. And so the way that I design curriculum is about that. There's a certain amount of the curriculum in every class that I'm actually sometimes more uncomfortably than others. I'm giving up control and putting some agency into the students' hands, right? And I think that I'm sure a lot of your listeners will relate to that. It can feel frightening as the educator giving up this power, right?
Yeah.
But when you've done it, you can really see the students growing. Right, you can see them making these choices. So like when I teach design, I might give this very open-ended class. I know that my design prompts might not be like fully worked out, and the students have to work through trying to make the design challenge clearer with me and with their colleagues, right? And I know it's a big lift, and sometimes it's that I just haven't figured out what the solution, where we should be going. but we are working together and giving the problem or the problem frame some clarity.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very important part of the learning process, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I know I talk in these long bursts, but the other thing is, the other thing is I think it's really, as an educator, I'm excited to learn with the students.
Yeah.
So I don't want to be the expert in, I mean, obviously there's some things I'll be an expert on, but I don't want to be like the only expert in the room when I'm working with students. And I'm very often trying to draw on their own expertise or knowledge about let's find the thing that you're an expert on. So, you know, a class that I'm working on now, they're the experts on TikTok, or, you know, like I have my social media, but they're the experts. Yes. So, I mean, I am giving over that expert space to them and letting them really expand and fill that role in the work that we're doing together.
That's beautiful. I feel like this theme of agency is something that is woven throughout all the work that we do, all the podcasts that we have. There's always this idea of like shifting power in some way. And in what that kind of brings up for us as educators is, of course, like how do we do that well with the constraints we have? And how do we move away from a control over paradigm or power over paradigm to a power with? And I think I think your example there is just a really good one, because it reinserts a novelty into a learning process. Because no longer, and I think the shift, across the board, by the way, is, you know, the knowers, like trying to be the best knower is actually problematic today. It's you need to be the best learner. And even like you think about, you know, cognitive augmentation and AI tools, et cetera, et cetera. Like, and so we talk about I know you have this beautiful designer's critical alphabet, which I was looking at before, which I love, Lesley-Ann. It's so cool. We have ours called the Learning Future Alphabet, which is kind of like what are the key principles for the future of education? And, you know, just at the beginning is agency, belonging, creativity, discernment, embodiment, flourishing, right? And so all of those, we think of the design principles for learning experiences, the way schools could, you know, and it's kind of how do you bring these principles and imbue them into the way that a school functions, in the way that a classroom operates? And to do that well, we have to create the right cultures and support the really hardworking educators in their emerging practices. That's really what I'm interested in, because this whole idea of letting go of the way I thought I was so that I could become who I could be, you know, paraphrasing some quote, I'm sure. Do you know like that?
I definitely want to get to your alphabet, right? That really sounds very good. I think I'm struggling to find sometimes examples of systems where this really works, but I know that it works in the design classroom. I'll say that. But I also want to see in general education where, you know, many of these learner-centered practices are really being supported. You know, and I hope that like your network has examples of this. But I think that it's beautiful that there are examples of learner-centeredness. Well, I'm from creative teaching, you know, and in the creative arts, I think that people have embodied this agency and learner-centeredness. And so like with my PhD, it was me I was trying to figure out how to capture what I felt were the strengths of art and design education and somehow put it in somewhere else in the school curriculum. So I was with elementary school children actually in my PhD.
Yeah. I mean, and I have to say, like, children seem to be pretty, you know, pretty good divergent thinkers. I always cite the research that actually they often outperform MBAs on divergent thinking assessments because they're so creative. And so in some ways it's just kind of cultivating that further to become designers. I think the reason I have so loved talking to all of the Stanford D.school guide authors and my time there at the D.school is because I've just realized that education is so much a process of design. And as
Yes.
educators, we are designers. But as a teacher, I never would have framed myself like that. I was a teacher. And so this idea of how do you like evolve your own role in this kind so that
Yes.
it's as contemporary and impactful and powerful and emancipatory
Mhm.
as possible. And I think that's a question of design.
It is design. Now, I kind of knew at some points, like, I used to be an actual, like, a real designer in
Actual
air
designer,
quotes.
product
Yes.
designer.
I used to design the furniture and stuff.
Right,
But
right. Yeah.
I remember somebody asking me at one point, so what do you design now? And I looked at them in shock and I'm like, but I'm always designing. You know, I'm designing new classes, I'm designing new curricula, I'm designing, so actually, yes, we're designing all the time. But really, like you, the time that I spent at the D school made me think more explicitly about the design,
Mm,
where, okay, we plan the class and we think of the arc of the experience of the user who's the student, right?
yeah.
Or we're thinking of, okay, how is the user going to be engaged in the process? So all of that is really, it's nice to see explicitly where someone is thinking about education as design, because it in fact is. And we have to be thinking about the experience of the people who are going through this education process as well.
Yeah.
With the hope that they are going to leave this experience so energized that they're going to want to, again, change the world.
Um, such a great conversation. I've got two final questions for you. One comes straight out of the book, because you
Mm-hmm.
say, there's so many beautiful quotes here, but there's this idea that in the idea of designing equitable futures, you talk about a focus on utopia opens up the frame for people to dream and imagine without the constraints of the current times. And I feel like that ability to kind of use futures is such a
Mm-hmm.
powerful way to then become an action-based change maker, like someone that's really moving to it.
Yeah.
So my question is like, what is the utopia that you are hoping we are designing towards?
Oh my.
And you can take about any, it's a huge question, but you can take it
Yeah.
any level of society, even if it's like
Yeah.
the way that universities function or the way that a community operates, like or education systems, which is the one that I focus mainly on. What
Yeah,
is it for you?
there's so many things. So actually, I'm also very invested in education. And that's part of why, that became the focus of my research,
Yeah.
where in a lot of places, there is a high stakes exam. Oh, well, there are a lot of places where there's high stakes testing, right?
Yeah.
But I was thinking particularly about the high stakes exam moving from elementary school into secondary school, which exists in a lot of places, not everywhere, but in the Caribbean where I'm from,
Mm.
this exam is still very prevalent. And I think that having such a high stakes exam so early in life really then means that your success in life depends on your parents and your class and so you really lose some of the agency,
Yeah.
and you're affected by all these external factors. So one of my utopias is where there is more equal access to good educational experiences across
Yeah.
class, across country, across, and I mean, sometimes when I say it, I think, oh, that is really, really utopia, right? That
Hmm.
not just because I am poor and I'm from a little speck in the middle of nowhere that I'm going to have a mediocre educational experience or less than satisfactory educational experience. I really imagine then a world where none of these things are going to affect the kind of education that you have.
Yeah.
Because I think that we have so many examples of good education that can happen without resources, right?
Yes.
So again, if I go back to like the Freirean work or the work that I've seen in Brazil or, other places in South America, there are lots of little experiments all over the world where there's fantastic education that's happening, and without $1 million. So maybe more of us could have that. Right? And like there are a whole lot of other things, but I think that education is really, really important.
Yeah.
And so people's access to good education, and good education that is not just about someone banking model of education. That's what Freire would talk about, where someone is just putting facts in your head, but education that's going to open up your mind and make you ask a lot of difficult questions.
The right questions. Yeah.
Yes.
I love that.
Yes.
The ability to frame the problem or frame the question, again, seems to be, to me, this idea of discernment. Which questions should we be asking? Which are the best ones?
Yeah.
Especially as kind of facts become more readily available. In fact, even synthesized facts, and eventually created AI agent element kind of conversations start to take place. It's a fascinating time.
Yeah. And the thing is, while you just talked about the facts, if the facts are so easy to find, then we don't need to memorize them, right? And so it's really a different kind of education paradigm that we need to be moving into.
Yeah.
Which some places have gotten already, but a lot more.
It's underway. Lesley-Ann, my final question for you is, across all this work that you've done, your decades of experience across different parts of the world, in the Americas in particular, what's the take-home message that you would have for educators that are listening to this, leaders that are listening to this conversation of ours?
That one is a difficult question, but let me see if I could find an answer for it. I think one takeaway is that there is more expertise in many more places than you might expect. So I talk about learning to listen and learning to see, so maybe then as an educator, we have to figure out, okay, how are we listening to the children who have their own level of expertise, right? How are we listening to parents? How are we listening to communities? How we, and how do we open the space for all of this expertise in the education process, so that it's not just the educator coming and saying, well, this is the curriculum and this is what we have to be doing, but we could somehow co-create some learning experiences that are useful for everyone. The message is that there is expertise everywhere, and we have to learn to see it and figure out how we're going to work with that expertise everywhere.
Yeah, it feels like to me it's such more of a life-giving process to do that in that way,
Yeah.
Instead of perhaps
exactly. It's also more rewarding for us, right? Because we learn more, we gain more in the process when we're open to this kind of again, to quote Freire would talk about dialogic experience. And so if we're open to that dialogue of learning with people and listening and having that conversation, then it's a much richer experience for everyone.
Beautiful. Lesley-Ann, thank you so much for spending your time with us today on the Learning Future podcast.
Thank you so much, Louka. I enjoyed this conversation.